The emergency room at St. Mercy Medical Center never truly slept. Even at 2 in the morning, the fluorescent lights hummed with a cold indifference over rows of plastic chairs, bolted to linoleum floors. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air like a permanent resident, sharp, sterile and somehow lonely. Nurses moved in efficient clusters. Monitors beeped behind curtained bays. And in the far corner of the waiting room, a man sat completely still, as if movement itself might cost him something he couldn't afford. His name was Thomas Waverley. He was 53 years old, with calloused hands, a worn grey jacket, and the kind of deep-set exhaustion that doesn't come from one bad night. It comes from years of them. Tom had worked construction for 28 years. He'd poured foundations for office buildings he'd never be invited inside. He'd framed walls for houses he'd never own. And 3 months ago, when the company he worked for went under without warning, he'd lost his health insurance along with his paycheck. He sat now with a manila folder on his lap. Inside it was a bill, $47,340. That was what it cost to save his daughter's life. Her name was Lily Waverley, and she was 19 years old. 2 weeks earlier, she had collapsed in the parking lot of the community college where she was studying to become a nurse, the first person in their family who would ever get a degree. A classmate had called 911. By the time the paramedics arrived, Lily was unconscious, her heart beating in a chaotic rhythm that the doctors later called a hypertrophic cardiomyopathy event, a structural defect in her heart, one she'd had since birth and never known about, had finally announced itself in the most violent way possible. The surgical team at St. Mercy had worked on her for 6 hours. She survived. And now Tom sat in a waiting room with a bill that was more than he'd made in the last 2 years combined, wondering how a man thanks God for a miracle while simultaneously wondering how he'll pay for it. He hadn't told Lily about the bill. She was still recovering in room 412, 3 floors above him, propped up against pillows and watching old game shows on a small television, completely unaware that the man who had loved her since the moment she took her first breath was now sitting downstairs, quietly coming apart. Tom opened the folder again. He'd read the itemized list so many times the paper was starting to soften at the folds. Surgical suite fees, anesthesiology, ICU monitoring, cardiac implant device. Each line was its own small devastation. He closed the folder. A woman sat down 2 seats away from him. Her name was Dr. Margaret Calloway, though no one in the waiting room would have known that from looking at her. She wasn't in scrubs or a white coat. She was wearing a plain blue cardigan, dark jeans and sneakers. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a loose bun. She looked like someone's grandmother, warm-eyed, a little tired, carrying a paper cup of vending machine coffee that she held with both hands, like it was something precious. She was, in fact, the chief of cardiology at St. Mercy Medical Center. Margaret was 61 years old, and she had spent the last 35 years of her life working in this hospital. She had performed over 4,000 cardiac surgeries. She had held the hands of people who didn't make it and delivered impossible news to families in this very waiting room. She had also, quietly and without ever speaking about it publicly, used a portion of her own salary every year to establish a small discretionary fund, money she personally used to help patients in financial crisis. She hadn't told anyone about the fund, not the hospital board, not her colleagues, not even her husband, who had passed away 6 years ago, and whose memory she carried like a second heartbeat. She was in the waiting room tonight because she couldn't sleep. She sometimes came down here on difficult nights, not to work, but just to sit among people who were fighting for something. She found it grounding. She noticed Tom immediately, not because he was loud or dramatic. Quite the opposite. It was how still he was, how he held that folder, how his jaw was set in the particular way of a person who has decided not to cry in public, not tonight, maybe not ever. She recognized that face. She'd seen it 1,000 times. "Long night?" she said simply. Tom looked up, mildly startled. He glanced at her, just a woman in a cardigan, nothing threatening about her, and gave a small, polite nod. "You could say that. Family? She asked. My daughter, he paused. She's okay. She's upstairs. She's going to be okay. He said it like he needed to hear it again himself. That's the most important thing, Margaret said. Tom nodded slowly. Then, because it was 2 a.m. and he was too tired to perform normalcy, he said quietly, I just can't figure out how to pay for it. Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't offer empty reassurance. She just looked at him steadily and said, Would you like to tell me about it? And he did. He told her about the construction job, about the insurance disappearing overnight, about the 3 months of odd jobs and borrowed money, and the checking account that now had less in it than the tip line on a restaurant bill. He told her about Lily's dream of becoming a nurse, and how Lily had cried when she first woke up after surgery, not because she was in pain, but because she was afraid the medical debt would force her to drop out of school. He told her about the foster care system both of them had grown up in, separately, in different states, and how they'd found each other through a DNA registry when Lily was 16, and how she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and how he would spend the rest of his life working gravel pits with his bare hands before he let her give up on her future because of a bill. He talked for almost 20 minutes. Margaret listened to every word. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, What's your daughter's name? Lily. Margaret smiled, a small, private smile. My mother's name was Lily. The next morning, Tom arrived early at the hospital's billing office, the way a man walks into a courtroom. Braced for a verdict he already knows is bad. The woman behind the desk, a tired-looking administrator named Cheryl Hoskins, pulled up Lily Waverley's account on her computer. She frowned at the screen. Then she frowned again. She clicked something, clicked it again. Mr. Waverley, she said slowly, it appears your daughter's account has been settled. Tom stared at her. I'm sorry? The balance. Cheryl turned the monitor slightly so he could see. The number at the bottom of the screen read 02 zeros. The room felt like it tilted slightly. That's not possible, Tom said. That's almost $50,000. I know what it was, Cheryl said, looking genuinely bewildered. It was paid this morning in full, through an anonymous charitable disbursement. She hesitated, then added, There's a note attached to the account. It says, she leaned closer to read, for Lily, so she can become the nurse she's meant to be. Tom sat down in the chair across from the desk. He didn't say anything for a long time. His hands, those calloused, work-worn hands, came up to cover his face. And this time he let himself cry. He took the elevator up to room 412. Lily was awake, sitting up in bed, picking at a hospital breakfast that she was pretending to enjoy. She was pale and thinner than usual, with a small bandage over her chest and an IV line running to her left arm. But her eyes were bright. They'd always been bright. Even in the worst moments of her life, those eyes had stayed lit. She looked up when her father walked in, and she immediately knew something had happened. Not something bad, something she didn't have words for yet. Dad, what's wrong? Why are you... Nothing's wrong, he said, his voice cracking on the last word. Nothing is wrong, sweetheart. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed and took both her hands in his. The bill is gone, he said. Someone paid it, all of it. Lily stared at him. What? Who? I don't know. He shook his head. I don't know who it was. They sat together in that small room, the machines beeping softly, morning light pushing through the window blinds in pale gold strips. Neither of them spoke for a while. There was nothing adequate to say. Finally, Lily looked at her father and said, very quietly, I'm going to be a really good nurse, Dad. I know you are, he said. I know. 3 floors down, in a corner office overlooking the hospital's courtyard, Dr. Margaret Calloway stood at her window with a cup of coffee. She was watching a pair of sparrows on the courtyard bench. 2 small things, unremarkable to anyone passing by, going about their morning with total certainty. She found birds reassuring. They didn't carry their burdens visibly. They just kept moving. Her assistant knocked and opened the door. Dr. Calloway, your 8 o'clock is ready. Thank you, Sandra. I'll be right there. She took one more sip of coffee. Set the cup down. No one would ever know it was her. That was the point. In her experience, the most powerful acts of kindness were the ones that didn't need an audience. You didn't give in order to be seen giving. You gave because somewhere in the architecture of a decent life, there was a room built specifically for that. Quiet, private, and load-bearing. She had built that room 30 years ago in honor of a patient she had lost when she was a young resident. A man named Roy, who had been a schoolteacher, and who had died not because the medicine failed, but because his family couldn't afford the medicine. That was the night Margaret Calloway decided that if she ever had money, she would use some of it to make sure that never happened to someone else. She never talked about Roy. She never talked about the fund. But every time she used it, she thought of him. She picked up her stethoscope from the desk, looped it around her neck, and went to work. 6 months later, Lily Waverley returned to St. Mercy Medical Center, not as a patient this time. She was wearing scrubs, light blue, a little stiff from being new, and a name badge that read Lily Waverley, student nurse extern. She had gone back to school 3 weeks after her discharge, against the advice of everyone except her father, and she had thrown herself into her studies with a ferocity that surprised even her professors. She was assigned to the cardiac ward. On her first day, she was introduced to the department by the head nurse, a brisk woman named Donna, who walked her through the unit and introduced her to the attending physicians. "And this," Donna said, pausing outside a corner office, "is Dr. Calloway, Chief of Cardiology. She performed your surgery, actually." Lily looked at the woman in the doorway. Silver-streaked hair, blue cardigan, warm eyes. Something in Lily's chest moved, not her heart, though that had been repaired, but something behind it, something deeper. She didn't know why. She had never met this woman consciously. She had been sedated through her surgery and had never been formally introduced to the surgical team. But Dr. Calloway looked at her and smiled, that same small, private smile, and said, "Lily, welcome. We're glad to have you." And Lily, who didn't know the full story yet and might never know it entirely, felt inexplicably like she was being welcomed home. That evening, Tom Waverley got a text from his daughter. It read, "Dad, I met the doctor who saved my life. She's incredible. I want to be exactly like her someday." Tom read it twice. Then he typed back, "You already are, kid. You already are." He set his phone down on the kitchen table, leaned back in his chair, and looked at the ceiling of the small apartment. He'd rented after getting a new job with a construction firm that this time came with benefits. Life was not without its cracks. It never was. But sometimes, not always, not guaranteed, but sometimes, a stranger sits down next to you in a waiting room at 2 in the morning, and the world quietly shifts towards something better. Sometimes kindness doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it just pays the bill and goes back to work. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to Soul of Kindness and hit the bell so you never miss a story. Every week we bring you real-feeling tales of human compassion, quiet heroism, and the strangers who change everything. Because kindness is always out there. Sometimes you just need someone to remind you.